Welcome. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Joseph Lam, musicology professor and associate of the LRCCS. I have the honor to host this lecture today. First, we have to say that this is the 10th and the final presentation in the noon lecture series of the LRCCS for the fall term of 2025. I'm sure you've done many. And of course, the series will resume in winter of 2026 with a talk on January 27, given by our own postdoc fellow, Andy Cao, who will be speaking on rapping minoritiness, rap as vernacular theory in China. That's it. So, but you give us a little bit more, few more days, a complete schedule will be available at the beginning of the term. So let me now go to the introduction for today's talk. Today's talk presentation will be given by Dr. Canaan Morse. His degree is from Harvard. He is now a postdoctoral associate lecturer in the Department of East Asian Languages, Literature, and Culture at the University of Virginia. He's a longtime devotee and just learned a former on-stage performer of Northern Chinese oral performance. And as a scholar, he studies interactions between spoken and written traditions in imperial Chinese literature. His current book project, Reading as Reliving, Tradition and Transmediality in Vernacular Chinese Fiction, demonstrates how many of the texts that guide the Chinese Persian canon of vernacular fiction evoke receptive contexts that reference multiple narrative traditions. Is really amazing. In addition, his translation of contemporary Chinese novels have won the Susan Sontag Prize for translation and has been named a finalist in the 2021 National Book Award. That's quite an achievement. Now, today he will be speaking on a very interesting title, The Image of the Book in the Performance of Reading, the Drunken Man's Talk as a chapter text. So without further ado, present to you, Dr. Morse.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. And before I get started, let me just express heartfelt gratitude to Professor Joseph Lam, Professor S.C. Kyle, and Director Ann Lin, and the rest of the LRCCS for inviting me to be a part of this wonderful series. It is an honor to talk to people here in my specialty, in one of the leading centers for Chinese studies in the country. Now, if I may. 静坐闲窗对短行，曾将往事广搜寻。也提流水高山去，也负阳春白雪吟。世上是非难入耳，人间名利不关心。编成风月3000卷，飒女知音论古今。Oh, good. There it is. This poem, which speaks in what I believe to be an overlooked voice, introduces the first chapter of a unique orphan text. In English, I sit serene by my window and shrinking candle, having gathered tales of old from far and wide. I quote verses on flowing water and high mountains, rhapsodize in the style of springtime and white snow. Worldly gossip cannot reach my ear, nor thoughts of profit disturb my mind. I compiled 3,000 chapters of breeze and moonlight for kindred spirits to speak of past and present. The text which this introduces is an orphan text titled The Newly Edited Record of Talking with the Drunken Man, the Xinbian Zuiweng tanlu, printed, we believe, sometime between the 13th and the 14th century, between the end of the Yuan dynasty and the beginning of the Ming, and attributed to an obscure literatus named Luo Ye. It is a total of 20 juan, the final 19 of which feature a diversity of entries: poetry, jokes, legal rulings, factual accounts and anecdotes, and even polished prose tales written in classical Chinese. These entries are highly intertextual. Almost 2/3 of them are adapted from other classical sources, and together they sort of reflect a fuzzy interest in literati pastimes with a particular fascination on the courtesan culture of the Jiangnan region. Now, if they were the only contents of this collection, we would say that the Drunken Man fits pretty neatly the profile of what we refer to loosely as 笔记文学, or notebook literature. This is a loosely defined genre of esoteric classical language collectania that rose to prominence right around the Song dynasty. The first chapter of this collection, however, is quite different. It presents two entries under the heading Prefaces for Plowing with the Tongue, 舌耕续引, right here, and here's the poem that I just read, which speak to the mission and techniques of oral storytelling in the voice of a professional performer. These two entries, which are respectively titled The Preface to Storytelling, 小说引子, and The Beginnings of Storytelling, 小说开辟, discourse on the artistic ancestry, mission, repertoire, and the techniques of oral storytelling grandiosely and in great detail, depicting the storyteller as both the consummate collector of orally transmitted stories and a master scholar of classical literature. Hitherto, I would say, scholars have generally engaged with this dipartite text as a source of information on historical storytelling praxis, and have drawn their conclusions about it and its reference based on appraisals of its historicity. Yet that interpretive angle has proven unproductive, and we'll see more specifically why, but in part because it forces us to either accept or discount certain claims that the text makes, especially regarding storytellers' classical literacy and their access to books. Now, by contrast, I would argue that if we read these entries, that is the two entries of the first fascicle, figuratively, as an instance of self-conscious persuasive speech, we unlock a much richer dimension. Specifically, we find that the text presents an automythology of oral storytelling performance in which text and performance coexist in a symbiotic and I would say sinusoidal relationship defined by mutual divergence, convergence, divergence, convergence, and so on. Now, the central conceit of this mythology, namely that a contemporary text represents a long-lost original text brought back to life through oral performance, resembles a common phenomenon of other global traditions known as the charter text. And when we map the charter text against our example, it helps us identify two culturally unique mechanisms that power the mythology in the Chinese case. The first is an instance of what I would call miraculously complete translation, which is represented through the term fuyan, which describes the somehow perfect and accurate yet expansive translation of set knowledge into contingent performance. And the second I describe as the performance of reading, in which the storyteller invokes images of books and literature, not on their own terms as texts to be read, but as avatars of ambient tradition, which the storyteller then reads via acts of performative virtuosity, which masquerade as textual interpretation. Altogether, I suggest that we find in this text a vision of oral tradition defined on its own terms as a transmedial practice that is not subordinate to classical literature, and which treats its products, both stage and page, not as endpoints, but as progressive stages, in a sort of double helix process of narrative rebirth and cultural rejuvenation. So what are we looking at here in this dipartite first fascicle? First, an interesting point to make, the poem that I intoned right at the beginning of Introductions to Storytelling is immediately followed by a note in small typescript with a utilitarian focus that tells you it can be used, the poem, for performing history, 言史, or telling sutras, 讲经. Subsequently, the greatest project of this first half is locating the storyteller's art within a cosmic superstructure of civilization, which begins with the beginning of time and adds storytellers into the ideal government model of the 9 fiscal agencies of the Zhou government, famously elucidated by the Han historian Liu Xin in the 2nd century. It then integrates the storyteller into dynastic history via a song and a subsequent prose explication, which moved from the prehistoric division of yin and yang, as they always do, all the way down through the Song dynasty, essaying to, quote, outline the flow of history from its beginnings. Via an implied first person, the narrator depicts the storyteller as one who is tasked with reenacting the progress of civilization through stage performance. The second half, beginnings, moves from mission to specific technique, enumerating multiple aspects of storyteller training, repertoire, and performative acumen in great detail. It describes the storyteller as a consummate reader, one who possesses an extensive command of both classical literature and non-textual improvisations, which allows him to be both authoritative and adaptable within the performed moment. After this reference to canonical literature, Beginnings goes on to list 111 abbreviated titles of traditional stories, which it presents as the storyteller's main stock in trade. Now, this list is very famous. It is long valued as a philological resource for those of us who study vernacular stories of the Ming, particularly those known as Huaben. And it has tempted many of us to assume a sort of direct correspondence between the tales we have and the titles that are listed, although that proves problematic. Finally, Beginnings speaks at length about the performative aesthetics of storytelling, which it describes in terms of a spectacular integration of seemingly opposed binaries, the high and the low, the literal and the affective, the fixed and the contingent. Now, these two entries share a powerfully self-referential perspective, which is why I lean toward a figurative reading, that is, reading them symbolically. And this self-referentiality emerges on a few levels. As I noted, we have several interlineal smaller notes within the text that seem utilitarian in origin, telling us how to vocalize the text and thereby fusing the speaker with the reader. Some passages, like the poem that I performed, though they never use the first person pronoun, it can be very, very hard to avoid it when in our interpretive process. I compiled 3,000 scrolls or 30,000 chapters to distribute among kindred spirits, that is everyone else, all of you. Furthermore, the entirety of both entries are composed in a mix of lyric and parallel prose that are palpably musical and emphasize the sense of subjectivity formally. They also switch between different modes of address, hortatory, evaluative, didactic, that emphasize speakerhood and the simulacrum of dialogue. In one example, after splitting all humans into categories of good and bad, the speaker goes on to say, the good are as rice and millet, the bad are like weeds and wormwood. How could they be worth speaking with? And thereby populating this discursive space with both a speaker and listeners after the fashion of an extempore performance group. In addition, the speaker invokes around this context, as I said, the full cosmic structure of civilization, which is immanently present, immanent with an A, and which subsumes all within interlocking and sometimes concentric structures of culture, classifying all beings, ordering all time, and subordinating all endeavors to the idyllic 9 fiscal departments of government. Now, the speaker himself describes this cosmic superstructure in primally textual terms. They reference central myths that equate the beginning of antiquity with the Promethean gift of writing, when graphs emerged from the Yellow and Lua rivers and divine rulers demarcated antiquity. They consistently reference the writing and rewriting of history as proof of progress, as achievements can be clearly chronicled, events recorded in order. And finally, they argue that the storyteller, who is of course encompassed by this massive superstructure, is also necessary in order to collect a textualized past when it falls into obscurity and reinvigorated. Storytellers transform abstruse and profound writings of antiquity into clear disquisitions for the present. And we may go back and forth about the translation of the term wenjiang, which, you know, we don't want to commit anachronism, but looking back at earlier sources, there is a clear sense of set pattern in the term, which I am connecting to a form of set textuality, even if we do not strictly interpret it as text. Heaven knows it does not mean articles. Now, this cosmic institution of culture requires the storyteller to survive, according to this depiction, because immanent culture exists in a superficially contradictory state of being, coherent but scattered. Immanent, but must be repeatedly articulated. Primordially textual, but requiring reincarnation through oral performance before it can then be rewritten. And in the spirit, let's go back to this first poem, which describes the relationship between the storyteller and this immanent superstructure of culture so clearly, and note how it requires the storyteller to constantly reincarnate the structure via the persistent integration of performance and text. So having, do I have a laser pointer? Having collected tales of old from far and wide, the solitary figure narrates, either with mouth or pen, as, quote, tea and rhapsodized fu can be done in either medium, selections from ancient classical verse, springtime and white snow, amidst the stories they have collected, which they then transcribe into many material scrolls to pass around among kindred spirits to discuss past and present. The final lines of our first section, Introduction to Storytelling, affirm the authority of historical records while recapitulating dynastic history and reinforce this sense of integration when they say, for the rise and fall of dynasties, we reverently refer to the histories. When extolling fame and merit, we hold to past events. We rely on old stories. And then it immediately follows it by a printed comment in a smaller typeface, which we've talked about. These are utilitarian in use. In some cases, storytellers follow their own intent, elaborating based on the event thus and so as they wish. So neither performance nor text is seen as a final medium. Each genre generates, each form generates and subsequently relies on the other. Now, this representation of a symbolically layered interpenetrative relationship between writing and performance is not unique to the Drunken Man's Talk, nor even to China. It closely parallels a feature that other ancient traditions that the Homeric scholar Gregory Nagy refers to as the charter text. In a recent article, Nagy engages with an argument by Peter Grossart regarding myths of poetic validation that underpinned epic traditions in Greece, Ireland, and Persia. Grossart cites one such myth about Homer, in which Homer is blinded by the radiant ghost of Achilles and refers to it as a charter myth. This is a set anthropological term that describes the kind of myth that etiologizes the overall identity of the group that transmits it. It's an identity myth, essentially. Now, Nagy suggests that the term could also apply to a different myth of Homer, which is claimed by a guild of singers on the Ionian Isle of Chios, in which Homer is blinded by the ghost of Helen of Troy when he refuses to burn his poetic creations. These are physical texts concerning her part in the Trojan War. Nagy notes that this myth presupposes the existence of a text. And he argues further that the Homeric singers of Chios, who claimed a genealogical or at least notional descent from Homer, represent the text of their rhapsodies that they used at their time as a reintegration of a mythologized original possession of an original Homer. Nagy goes on to cite other examples, including the Irish text, the Toyn Buculinga, the Toyn, or the Cattle Raid of Cooley, and the Persian Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, that tell a similar story. In the Toyn, the Cattle Raid of Cooley, of course, a bard receives a text orally from the ghost of the hero who recites the ancient text to him, the bard goes off and sings it, and that text is then later retranscribed. Whereas in the Shahnameh, our origin is that the king calls the various oral performers back to the palace, and each performs the section of the Book of Kings that he knows, and it is from their collective performance that the text is reconstituted. Nagy concludes, the reality of the charter text becomes a reality, a metaphor for the reality of the myth. So the text of the Toyn, that is the later text, is not only a reality, it is also a metaphor for the oral tradition. Without the integrative power of the oral tradition, Nagy suggests, the text is saying there cannot exist an integral book. Now, I would suggest that Nagy's concept of the charter text as a structure of metaphorical representations maps quite closely onto our plowing narrative. In doing so, also, it clearly illuminates this notional process that connects the metaphors, in our Chinese case, and allows them to function. In plowing, this process connects distinct or superficially contradictory values, constancy and contingency, literality and paraphrasis, accuracy and affectivity, via the transformational node of oral performance. Now, two stages of this process that now jump out at us quite clearly involve an accurate yet somehow expansive translation of the textualized knowledge being reincarnated, and the invocation of the actual image of text. Again, both inflected through the performance frame. Now, this process of expansive translation emerges via the term fuyan, which appears 3 times in plowing as both a specific and a general descriptor of the mechanics of telling. First, I have attempted to expansively narrate fuyan, the general course of history from its beginnings. In presenting introductions and conclusions, storytellers adhere to the standards set by great masters and, through performative elaboration, also fuyan, they edify their audience. Finally, when they expand through performance, fuyan, they stay structured and conclude cleanly. Now, the roots of this term are undeniably Buddhist. It appears thousands of times, literally, in both canonical and lay Buddhist records between the 2nd century CE and the end of the Ming in 1644. The examples involving secular performance, which come a little later on in that timeline, all post-date and should be read against that context. So despite its ubiquity in Buddhist texts, strangely enough, the term is not consistently glossed. It is not specifically glossed. A Song era commentary on the Lotus Sutra glosses fuyan once as to spread out ceaselessly, and then twice as to spread out and explicate performatively. Fu bu yan shuo. But this is a late entry. When we look back at the whole, we can generally say that it denotes an oral explication of truth for the purposes of enlightening a public audience. Early examples involve groups or individuals on behalf of groups petitioning Buddha to fuyan, essential aspects of eternal dharma, with Buddha's response frequently emphasizing connections to texts, especially sutras. This exegetical function of translating the profound and unchanging, but difficult doctrine into comprehensible narrative persists throughout the source material, but it doesn't define fuyan entirely, because texts place it alongside explication, simple interpretation, without completely conflating the two. Moreover, fuyan is institutional. It's recognized as a core discipline for monks alongside sutra recitation and ascetic practice. Being a disciple involves undertaking the recitation, transcription, and performative speaking, yan shuo, of the 12 sutras, including undertaking the recitation, transcription, fuyan, and explication of the Mahanirvana Sutra. So it puts them together, does not quite conflate the two. Texts from the Tang Dynasty onward frequently use it also to reference both itinerant and residential preaching, sometimes in front of large crowds. Jing Shao returned to the Jianyuan and Jinling temples to Fuyan, performatively explicate the sutras and doctrines, besting all the other schools. So although we lack specific denotative descriptions, we can identify Fuyan in the Buddhist context as a practice of explicating abstruse knowledge, which is envisioned as set and frequently envisioned as textual, via an oral performance that is subject to the appraisal of audiences and institutions. Now, later, Fuyan will maintain these connotations when it describes performances of scripts and historical accounts of secular performance from the era that surrounds the drunken man's talk. So there is a very, very commonly cited description of oral performance in the inimitable sites of the capital, the Ducheng Qisheng, which, by the way, lists performing sutras as a subgenre of storytelling that runs thusly. Puppet performances elaborate and expound Fuyan, stories of romance or demonic encounter, martial prowess, court cases, and so forth. Some of their story texts resemble variety plays, others resemble chantifables, generally heavy on fiction and light on fact. Now, for our purposes today, the binary in focus may not be fictionality versus facticity, but this concept of the story text, which is the way I'm interpreting the complicated term huaben, which is imagined as fixed original information versus its translation and expansion via an event in performance. Another 13th century anecdote echoes this interpretation, in which Wu Zimu tells us that the Xiaoshuo performer 6th nobleman Wang, quote, performed Fuyan, the reclaiming China, and the biographies of famous generals in a resurgent realm to large audiences. Even further, Fuyan maintains these connotations across its 5 appearances in the Yuan Dynasty Zaju plays that are preserved in the Yongle Encyclopedia. Even in the shortest such example, from a playboy from a noble house opts for the wrong career, the female protagonist Wang Jinbang, an actress, is asked to summarize Fuyan, the plays she knows and has listed on her material Wade Mekum, her Zhangji. And it reflects this extension to the extent this interpretation to the extent that she responds by performing this list of written titles as a rhymed aria in a sort of oral advertisement for her own competence as an actress, giving us the image of a text presented through a performance within a performance. Now, within the translational context that's invoked by our mechanism of Fuyan, another culturally unique dynamic in plowing brings together these contradictory values I've mentioned: coherent books versus scattered tales, canonical literature versus authorless stories, textual accuracy versus contextual adaptability, and erudition versus entertainment in what I describe as a performance of reading, which is a kind of symbolic bait and switch in which the storyteller appropriates the images of texts into this cosmic superstructure of culture that we have examined. And this brings us into a passage in Plowing that has caused so much confusion, in which the speaker champions the storyteller's classical erudition and access to text. Although untutored, storytellers have heard of many matters. They are well read and possess penetrating perception. From their youth, they study the Taiping Guangji, while from adulthood, they mine history books of all periods. There are none who do not peruse the record of the listener, the Yijianzhi, whilst they are thoroughly familiar with everything in the Xiuyingji. When they discuss lyric poetry of the greats, they have the fine lines of Ouyang, Su, Huang, and Chen. When speaking of old-style poems, there are those of Li, Du, Han, and Liu. Now, where people have been focused and where they often get tripped up is evaluating this passage historically and suggesting, as one scholar does, these must be imperial storytellers because they have access to text. Or, by contrast, this is a bunch of horse hockey because especially the Taiping Guangji and the Yijianzhi were extremely hard to come by in that era. But if we step away from the facticity of these claims, and as I have suggested, we consider them as part of the charter text, we read them metaphorically, we find our focus drawn to the power of the symbols. The titles and the literary names that this passage enumerates evoke for the reader the comprehensiveness and authority of classical literature. And as we are about to see, the speaker presents them not as texts to be read and interpreted exegetically, but as metonyms, as name brand constituents of an ambient tradition. Notice where the text goes from here. Depending solely on their eloquent tongues, they praise what is right and condemn what is wrong. With recourse to many thousands of yarns, they ruminate on matters both ancient and modern. To conclude a story, they employ an inexhaustible range of devices, whereas for the beginning, they might draw upon several thousand variations. And they have tales of the strange, of love, of the marvelous, legal cases, swordsmen, stave wielders, and immortals. The list of 111 traditional story titles, which, by the way, do not belong to the classical canon and are almost entirely not recorded in the rest of this collection, immediately follows this. And several of our binary associations are already emerging. Canonical literary names share space with innumerable folk tales, some with names, some without. The practice of textual reference and citation coexists with the need for constant adaptation. And the aesthetic goal of entertainment incorporates both moral inspiration and scholarly accuracy. And the final lines of prose before the concluding poem of the whole fascicle emphatically reinforce this. When storytellers appraise, they do not stall or natter on. When they expand through performance, they stay structured. They know how to sing their lyrics, recite their poems, tell their stories, and pull off their jokes. Their words, unfettered by error, elicit praise from gentlemen of quality. And as their stories are based on sources, they cause the talented to sigh in contentment and astonishment. So, poems and lyrics are paired with stories and jokes. Tales remain unfettered by error and true to their sources, even as they expand, contract, and transform within the plastic context of performance. And a thrilling performance relies on moral rectitude and referential accuracy in its bid to enable the audience's emotional connection to narrative material, because the emotional connection, that is, this affective reception of the tale, is the utmost goal. Because when they address the treachery of dynastic traitors, they incite the dull-witted to anger. They embolden the heroic, inspire the talented to turn to their books, encourage the down and out, and shame the devious. So despite this rhetorical emphasis on accuracy, or alongside it, shall I say, the storyteller's narrative is certainly no textual exegesis as we understand it. Instead, it is a reweaving of the warp and weft of cultural heritage in order to revivify its colors and inspire an effective recognition of the cultural self that motivates emotional or physical action. The very real textual items that are being cited, from the Taiping Guangji to the lyrics of Su Shi and Li Bai, are not necessarily summoned as texts, but as the symbols of texts. And the performance of reading them and connecting the group to tradition that they stand for takes place via an active self-conscious speech. Both of the entries in Plowing unambiguously centralize speaking, and more specifically, performative competence. They invoke no fewer than 9 synonyms for the act of speaking. Assertions like this one, which we have just seen, emphasize the presentation of literature as a spectacle of verbal virtuosity. To quote the ethnopoeticist Richard Bauman, the Plowing storyteller, quote, assumes accountability to an audience for the way in which communication is carried out, because his performance is subject to public scrutiny, and the audience will evaluate his lyrics, poems, stories, and jokes for the way that they are told. A masterful performance leads the group to an effective climax that offers, to quote Bauman again, an enhancement of experience, causing men of talent to sigh in contentment and astonishment. And within this communicative context, which is suffused with the images of books, authors, and the authority of the classical tradition, the storyteller performs what I've described as this referential bait and switch. Invoking the image of literature, the teller assumes the role of an authoritative reader whose virtuosic performance revivifies imagined text back into the gestalt, the living gestalt of cultural identity. Finally, the significance of this reading. I really think it emerges most clearly when we compare it as an oral tradition's vision of itself and the narrative world that it perpetuates to more mainstream depictions of oral tradition that later literati and much later scholars, I would suggest, leaned on to explain the development of written vernacular fiction. So whereas the plowing storyteller envisions oral tradition in terms of a symbiotic relationship between writing and telling, executed by a professional reader-performer who integrates aesthetic standards. By contrast, many later literati from the Ming Dynasty onward describe storytelling in a subaltern position vis-a-vis classical learning and fetishize it as an anonymous, primeval, and simplistic practice. When the 16th century literatus Lang Ying explains the origin of vernacular fiction, written fiction, he of course points to oral performance as its primitive origin. He first repeats a story about anonymous oral tales being textualized to entertain a bored emperor, and then points to similarly nameless performers of xiaoshuo and taozhen, two prosometric oral genres at the time, as these primitive origins for the written xiaoshuo stories of past generations that were being re-anthologized in his time. To literati like these, oral tradition is a source of raw cultural energy to be appropriated for the sake of supplementing and revitalizing the classical tradition, which, by the way, is not itself recycled as part of that process. In his argument for harvesting the folklore of the people and revising it, editor Feng Menglong notes, he makes that the classics and the histories can only go so far. And when they lose their power to convert people, we are better off going to the direct, if rough and unhewn tales of the rustic men and boys, the rural wives and peddlers, to allow those tales of clear-cut distinction, karmic cause and effect, to change us and supplement what the sclerotic classical tradition cannot. Now, this perspective and his editorial behavior to some extent reflect the values of what we call folklorism, which is an ideology of figures like Johann Gottfried von Herder and the Brothers Grimm in post-Enlightenment Europe, as well as Hu Shi and other revolutionary scholars of Republican China, which fetishizes folk culture as an ownerless cultural spirit that can be distilled as medicine to cure elite intellectual malaise and revitalize national political projects that keep elites at the top. And so in conclusion, I will say that this in particular, the contrast, bears upon our work in Chinese literature when we are digging into texts that once circulated in the orbit of oral tradition, because a folkloristic perspective conveniently leads us into limiting assumptions about those texts, inviting us to discount their expressive capabilities, to read their metaphors as flat cliché, to see them as fundamentally and exclusively separate from live oral performance traditions, and to view them as transitional texts that will eventually inspire better literature. And to all of this, the storyteller of plowing provides a powerful counterpoint, because the texts that participate in his tradition play a part in a hybridized narrative aesthetic that is capable of reaching across media. And to that storyteller, to that voice, text is not a telos, but an interstice, which reaches out and holds together the intertwining threads of a transmedial tradition, which, in my opinion, makes the expressive capacities of those texts worthy of a closer look. Thank you very much.
Another possible way to think about feeling you have the Iranian version of stories circulating, and that's what is. And they have been vernacularized. And so they just have a good vocabulary for vernacularization. And so I would expect that Fuyang will include that process.
It's interesting because there was a huge debate starting in the 1950s about the meaning of the term huaben, right? In which you had a previous generation that was like, no, these were story texts that they were scripts that people read, right? And then we have people coming back and beginning with Masaru Watada, who says, no, huaben means story in general. And I think an intermediary position that aligns with Watada's evidence points to the idea or the concept of a huaben as a fixed thing. And the process of performance is this sort of idealized practice of perfect translation, expansion, in which you turn the fixed thing into the thing of the moment. And yet somehow you have the same thing. I didn't have time. I put this in an article. This has become an article in which I talk about the implications for the rest of our Drunken Man text, which again is mostly these classical stories. And it can be very, very difficult because you can get speculative very, very quickly if you have no rhetorical evidence with all of these other entries, collected entries. You can make all kinds of arguments that at the end of the day don't have much to support them. But that opens that possibility that you see that there is a habitual, institutionalized connection between the concept of set text and the act of performance, which transforms it, translates and expands it in the moment.
In the Buddhist text, you have that kind of expansion going on.
Yeah.
In the Lotus Sutra, you hit them in a pose first and you're offering this.
Yeah, and one like an important thing to point out is that again there are almost no glosses of the term, even though it appears approximately. I mean, when you search C beta, you get 1,400 instances going from antiquity to the end of the Ming Dynasty, and it participates in this process of, well, truth is rujing, right? It's like the sutras; it is textualized, but Buddha will fuyan it for you as an expedient means, right? This is a tool of Mahayana Buddhism, an expedient means that will still get you there. Yeah.
And I have a question of maybe on the textual level, how do you distinguish what is rhetorical and what is performative? Because text written in certain generic traditions can potentially be performable, and we can imagine that performance going on stage,
of course,
but then purely on the textual level, seeing the text in its own way, how do you distinguish the performative quality of it and rhetorical rhetorics?
So there are two questions there. The question that I attempt to answer most solidly is that our dipartite first fascicle of the Zuiweng tanlu quite coherently continues to point to itself and generate an image of subjectivity as it describes. That is to say, it builds a voice. Now, your more general question about the relation, how we read texts that may be proximate to performance for which a tradition has fallen silent, right? How do we tell question, right? And the first thing we do is we never deny the documentary nature of the evidence. We don't pretend that something, we don't pretend historical usage when we have no evidence for it. But we do note the capacity of performance communities to create texts that participate in the interpretive rules of performance or of their performance tradition. There are a few patterns that emerge, even though this is basically an inductive process. There are a few patterns that emerge, and one of them is the capacity of, or the frequent habit of a text that participates in an oral tradition to reach for tradition, particularly to reach for tradition that appears to exist outside of the text. And this happens differently in different genres. Certain, like for instance, if you look at if we were to look at actual scripts from, say, the early Republican period, song texts and things like that, they assume that you know things, right? And when you read them as an outside viewer, you get a very, very strong sense of yourself as an outsider. Because if we read them purely as text, which whether or not we do that ever is debatable. But if we try to read them independently, they tend to feel like they're full of holes. There tend to be aporie or logical cruces that just don't make sense. And that should, in some cases, if we find that justified, spur us to go back and look for places in which this text appears to be reaching to sources of meaning that lie beyond it. That's one short answer. I wrote an entire dissertation on how to answer that question. Yes. Other questions, maybe? Yes, please.
So somewhat of a big question. And so what strikes me about your reading, which to me seems very convincing, is when we place it in the context of Song and Ming BT, but the shift seems to be from prefaces that position the author at the margins of politics, right? Prefaces refer to retirement, to being in exile, to aging. And here, right, the distance is a different one. Of orality, it's a different position. So within oral and written textual traditions. And I was wondering whether you could say something about that, about what we learned from this about the position of the Zuiweng tanlu. Within what is recognizable as a somewhat definable genre of mediation between literacy and orality. So I wondered whether, as part of that, you can tell us a little bit about what you say in the article about how this reading of the first gen informs your reading of what follows.
Of everything else, yeah. So is the article out there?
I don't know. I thought you said that.
Oh, okay. No, because it's out for review right now. And I was like, wait.
No,
it's interesting. Do I accidentally, at any point, leave the word preface in here? Because when I first did this talk, I used the term preface and I no longer did.
No.
Oh my gosh, you're right. This was the early draft, and I started eliminating it because obviously, if this first fascicle is a collected piece of text, then there's no immediate argument. I'm so sorry for it adding preface.
It was my interpretation as similar to prefaces.
No, but this is great because it has a sense, because it's very tempting to think of it, read it as prefatory, and that is a question. The article deals with how this reading affects the possibility of reading it as prefatory, because especially if we compare it to later prefaces like Feng Menglong's preface to this, the Gujin Xiaoshuo and all of that and the later things, a very different relationship between performance and text is being invoked to start off a collection of text, right? And I would say, first of all, this reading emphasizes the actual points of diversity in the rest of the Zuiweng tanlu. We do have an abiding interest in courtesan culture. Have we also have a paucity, relative lack of entries in this collection that would appear to have been written by Luoye himself. There are only a small number of entries that are unsourceable, that are contemporary to the time period, and that seem like they could have been written by a single individual. The rest have been commented on or edited or pulled directly from earlier sources. And I think this reading, a metaphorical reading of this first fascicle really highlights the extent to which these entries, the rest of the material, feels like it has been pulled from many sources. That it could potentially, I don't want to speculate, but it could potentially participate in a process of narrative or a vision of narrative that is multifunctional and multimedia. That thinks of collection, telling, and retelling as an integrative process.
Canaan, thank you for really rich talk, and I won't challenge anything because I like this.
Please do.
A synological thing is very good, but then I'm a musicologist, so I'm more interested in the more technical performance part of it. So there are many questions I want to ask you too. Now, your theory about all this performance orality coming from the Buddhists, the chanting, that in reference to Huaben and so forth, that's totally good. But then how do you justify the earlier tradition of Chinese orality of text, especially because I'm working on Shi Jing. And then as my theory goes, then there is an orality tradition from very early on ancient China to that. So how do you link that tradition to this orality?
I don't. So what I really want to say is I am doing my best to research inductively. One thing we find whenever we research a body of, especially texts for which any possible proximate oral tradition has fallen away, we do our best to say, here's one thing, right? And we look at this one thing, and this one thing tells us X, Y, and Z. And this is because oral traditions, I tend to stay away from the word orality because it is so hard to define. I'm looking instead at traditionality, because it is traditionality that tends to relate so many of these texts to worlds of oral performance, genres of oral performance. And so I would, for instance, I would be tentative about where I go specifically with this, for instance, going backwards. Now, going forwards, I would argue, for instance, based on this reading, I would look at certain aspects of the Huaben tradition, like a phenomenon called the poem chain, in which you have a sequence of poems that are listed one after the other. And if you read them from a purely textual perspective, they seem to be playing on this like very, very tenuous connection. And earlier readings of the poem chain have read them that way. Oh, this is a literary game in which the author is attempting to go from poem to poem to poem based on the sort of most tenuous, scantest connection between all of these poems. But when we think about text in terms of an act of verbal virtuosity, especially if we can connect those texts to an ambient tradition or to the sense of an ambient tradition, then we have another reading, an immersive reading, in which you are expected to receive the text on affective level, on an affective level and an integrative level as well.
But if we got that, so I understand your inductive method and trying to stay on the verifiable data, and that's very good, and that's what we want to do. But at the same time, if you really push your ideas about the multimedia, the traditionality and effectiveness, then you have to go to the orality, the sonic part that is not clearly written. Because you see, I mean, as you read the first poem, I can see you can read it as a reference to literature or text, but actually you can read it as a reference to oral practices of formulas.
Yes, absolutely.
So then there's a historical questions of where do these techniques of orality come from?
Yes.
Right? Yes. So for me, of course, it comes from that old traditional poetry, chanting, reading. So then that's the question. And because it affects your whole theory of affective multiple traditionality and the fusion between the text and the oral performance.
No, absolutely. If you're asking about historical context specifically. Okay. So this is where I have newly found textual items from, for instance, the Buddhist tradition to be both significant and highly frustrating. Because as I say, they start talking about fuyan as an institutional practice among Buddhist Sangha in the early 2nd century scriptures that are translated by An Shigao, right? Our Armenian supposedly translator into Chinese. And as I've mentioned, there is a absolute bevy of these examples in which they describe the practice, or they either mandate or they slightly describe the practice of fuyan without turning to fuyan and telling you what it means. But there is a multi-century practice there. In the case, we are luckier when we look at the Song, because we have this small grouping of descriptions from sort of guidebooks that at least gesture towards historical acts of performance. We also have texts like the 30 plays from the Yuan, right? The Yuan Zazhu 30种, which present us with a conspicuous lack. And that might be a decent way to put it. When we find a text, as I was saying before, that has obvious holes, right? We sort of have to begin to work around those aporia. I am so not a Shijing specialist. I don't even want to get close.
No, I'll tell you this and then I'll shut up. Then we can talk more. So when you say the fuyan, tradition, that's obviously there. You're on firm ground. But historically, musicologically talking about, from the Shijing tradition, there's this long tradition of xiange.
Okay.
So that we really do not know what it is, exactly like your problem with fuyan. But then the question is, then they are at least literally from wording. We know that there's a long tradition of orally performing this poetic text, such as Shijing and the Yuefu Shijing. So then with some kind of accompaniment. So then that tradition for me is actually an earlier layer of what you're talking about. And all the issues of activity, tradition, functions, they all together to link together. But I just wanted to hear how you coincide these two traditions.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the former tradition, so I wouldn't.
Okay.
I would feel completely out of my depth there. Yeah.
Because that's the tradition I'm trying to reconstruct. And the fascinating thing is, Shijing now is suddenly being read, being sung very vibrantly today. And then the tradition is, what the heck are they doing? How do they reconstruct these things?
Yeah, and this is where we get a further layer of meaning, I believe, from certain principles that are enunciated by our plowing narrator, because he describes an act of integration and what we call emergence in oral narrative studies, in which oral narrative traditions are constantly not only changing the content of their performances, but they are, as I've discovered, actively reaching out into new media technologies like text, or even in the contemporary moment, like Himalaya, like the Chinese web app, the streaming app, in order to expand access to the performance tradition. They are fundamentally integrative, and they are persistent. That is, they either make themselves evergreen or they die. And this becomes particularly important when we carry folkloristic biases back to texts that are somehow orally proximate, because we tend to focus on limitations, we tend to focus on distance, we tend to anonymize the humans that may have used them, whereas the story of the plowing is all about the professional. It's all about this consummate storyteller professional standing in the middle of the stage and letting the world be reborn through them. All right? Yes? We have no idea. We have no idea. The question of literature, and that, again, figurative reading, right? Let me give you a great example. So in the end of the Ming Dynasty, a Korean embassy came to Beijing, and this is the early Qing. One of the members of the legation traveled through the markets, and he saw a storyteller telling the story of the three kingdoms, okay? And he had in front of him a book. And he would tell the story. And as he told the story, he would point to the book and he would tell the story. And the book was the water margin. And it was upside down.
Yeah.
So we have here the image of the book. And even if you go out and you listen to, Pingshu nowadays, even if you listen to Zhang Yi perform Pingshu Honglou, she has read the book, of course, but when she tells the story, she will do things like say, 大家读过红楼梦的都知道, right? Everyone who's read 红楼梦 knows, and then she'll come out with some long interpretation that has almost nothing to do with the text or is only tangentially related to the text. Wang Yuebo does this with 水浒传 all the time. He'll say something like 水浒传里边没写，但是 or he will say that something happens in 水浒 at a certain point that totally does not. So in many cases, they're working with images. Right? It's like if I sit down and I'm like, I'm going to tell you the story of Hong Lou Meng, even if you grew up in China, you have never read Hong Lou Meng, you still know the text. You know, it's not actually a book, it's the image of a book.
Matthew, kind of contemporary way of performing Pingshu. Because when I recall from the Shan Tianhuang and the Hucheng's period, I don't think they ever evoke that. It was not written in the text, but I interpret it as so it seems to be very contemporary.
Well, it's interesting because unfortunately with the Shan Tianfang and the Yuan Kuocheng, those two performers, most of their performances have also been either edited or the performer himself has shrunk them considerably to fit television or radio media. Particularly television media. This is really interesting. The effect of television on Tian Lianyuan's performances, because he was the preeminent television Pingshu performer, has been significant. So the act of citation is a complicated one, but it can be effective and symbolic as well as, shall we say, textual and genuine. You know, yeah. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Some Chinese stories have real staying power,
Yeah.
even into the West. And I was thinking about the Zhang Songfeng, the martial artist. Did his story begin as a complete fiction per the exonerate martial arts, or did it have a historical basis and then become fantastic?
That's an excellent question that I don't know the answer to.
I don't think there could be an answer.
Yeah. Well, sometimes it's not. You know, it's funny. We look for sources, and it's a very textual act for us to look for sources because the values of textuality, and I'm citing Walter Ong here, sort of quietly, is that text privileges itself. It privileges permanence, distance, authenticity, and authorship, whereas oral tradition tends to privilege integration, somatic, multimedia access, and immediacy. Immediate connection to an ambient tradition. So when we look into these stories with staying power, we find that one of their clearest common characteristics is this like transmediality. They're sort of like the stories of the Marvel universe. We call it a universe because it spans multiple media, right? Comics, movies, action figures, everything else. And the reason that it develops metonymic power. That is, we see the hammer, we think Thor. We see the green skin, we think the Hulk, right? The reason it develops that sense of where we just see the one symbol and it brings the whole character to life is very much due to that transmedial existence of the story. And in China, I mean, you know, the water margin, the Romans to the Three Kingdoms, the journey to the West have lived transmedially for many, many centuries, and now Hong Kong as well.
Pretty obscure text, but there are two English translations. The earliest one is the worst example of it. But the more recent one, the English.
Yes.
And can you make any comments about that? It's about 10 different. Recommend it?
I do not. I recommend it for convenience. But for instance, there are several instances. So for instance, when I talk about weeds and wormwood, where is it? Oh, here it is. This line lines like this, the good are as rice and minute, the bad are like weeds and wormwood. How could they be worth speaking with? 起足共话. English translates phrases like this. He translates this as, how could they be worth talking about? Which, in my opinion, completely mistranslates the kind of the denotation of 共话, which we have specific examples of. The English, that translation also does a lot of weird things in really important places, and miswrites the opinion for some of the characters. So not my favorite.
Also, the guy has written the rules about
He writes 一件事. He writes 一件事, which, and I tried to get a hold of him and I couldn't find him at Simmons. But whatever. Like, there are a lot of notes. He annotates the classical sections very, very studiously. But there are also a lot of errors. Yes, Kyle.
So I'm wondering, because you mentioned this context, but then you also have this
Mm-hmm.
And so I was just thinking about this range of quality associated with this particular figure, storyteller, and I'm wondering how they connect. First, because you started right out with this reference to Jiangxi. And so that makes sort of the relationship of all of this to the source of traditions and other but then also when you're thinking about stage performance, it's Zachu in particular, which would have one main figure who on stage is probably doing something that shares something with this figure of the storyteller. I wonder, when you think of it more broadly about this, so where are the connections that you see?
Yeah, so I think about this when I look at the older sources. My focus is naturally drawn to the connection between evangelism and entertainment, and that powers or is used to enable a perfect translation of something that is believed to be permanent but invisible into something that is immediate, expansive, and visible. Our earliest Buddhist scriptural uses of the term, very, very early on, conflate the sutra as the representation of truth with simply Dharma. You can fuyan Dharma. Buddha fuyans Dharma. He also fuyans Dharma 如经, right, according to or in the manner of or with reference to the sutras. I was not, when I was looking through the Buddhist sources, I did not have the energy or the time immediately to filter out those which were connected to the Dunhuang texts. But as we move into uses of fuyan in secular performance, including Zaju, many of which shared a stage, they tend to correspond in terms of this idea that there is a story. There is a traditional story which is understood as an original, set, fixed thing. And so, and the performer, whatever they're performing, puppet plays, other 小说, ancient 小说, 杂剧, they get into the performance context, and through their mastery, the set thing becomes a visible thing. It becomes a contingent. And this is the process that, honestly, I'm still looking at and thinking about, because it involves, it assumes this weird practice of perfect translation, like perfect paraphrasis, right? Is that answering your question or approaching an answer? All right. Sorry. Oh, yes, please.
Yeah, can I make a It's more of a comment.
Please.
It seems that what your reading of this text makes visible, I think, is I guess an inherent permeability between writing and incompleteness, writing and memorization, writing and performance in all traditions. Right?
Yeah.
Because poetry was recited and memorized. The classics were memorized and recited. Jushi somewhere says the ancients had no texts.
Right.
Right, because they did these things, and at some point they were written down, but the writing was always secondary. Of course, the sutras take the form of sermons,
right?
And so they're always incomplete and imperfect. And so in that sense, I guess this exposition in the first gen makes visible what is actually much more of a mainstream concept of truth, relationship between truth and language, whether spoken or written.
Yeah.
And yes, as you say, right, we generally don't think of it that way because we are so wedded to text and imagine that people in the past were as well. So yes, that's very good.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes.
Thank you so much for the talk. I have questions like following these two professors. So I don't really know much about this, but I kind of wonder, like, to what extent can we apply the significance or the meaning of Fuyan in the religious text to the literary text? Because I wonder, like now we have a tendency to kind of like study this kind of like literary text through a kind of intermediate or multimedia landscape. But I kind of wonder, like, during that time, the readers really like have an understanding when they hear about these words like the Fuyan. They really kind of link it to previous traditions or even to the specifically to the literary to the religious text. If there are any like later sources or commentaries that specifically like pointed out this kind of relationship between the religious like significance of Fuyan and the literary significance of.
Yeah, I mean, my entire project, quite honestly, involves the elucidation of how certain texts that either are oral proximate or claim to be oral proximate, how they invite readers to receive them, what modes of reception they invite, and why. One, I won't go on because we're over time, but I will suggest a really, really interesting piece of work that I have done, and I suggest you look at, is comparing the original Yunmen Zhuan, the Shanta fable, to Feng Menglong's recension of it in Li Daoren Dubu Yunmen, because it's quite clear that he has specifically read this Shanta fable, not only because the opening poem says it, but because the prose content of Li Daoren maps 83% onto the prose section of this 1550s Shanta fable. And the question of how he changes the text takes you naturally to the question of why. And so you end up with as clear a perspective as we sometimes can get on how aesthetic standards for narrative change in certain instances, not in all, but in some. All right, well, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.